Good evening, everybody, and good evening to those who are watching in the overflow room, which is, I would say, a first for a Brennan Center for Justice event. I'm Michael Waldman. I'm the president of the Brennan Center for Justice here at NYU School of Law. We are thrilled to welcome all of you, thrilled to welcome our distinguished panel. My first job is to pretend we're in a Broadway play and ask you to turn your phones onto silent. That's because we're live streaming this and taping it. It'll be on our website and maybe a podcast, and we want radio quality sound. The Brennan Center, for those of you who don't know, is a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated here at the law school. We work to reform and revitalize, and when necessary, defend the systems of democracy and justice in America. And it is plainly the case that those systems are facing stresses and strains of an intensity that we have not seen in many, many years. As you know, this is 1 year to the, well, not to the minute, but 1 year to the day since the election of Donald Trump as president.
2 more hours.
2 more hours. Right. She was still a shoo-in as of 6:15, so that's true. It's 1 year. It feels like it's been at least 100 years, maybe a million years, but it's only 1 year. And we wanted to think, how can we mark this milestone, this unusual period in our country's history? We did not want to have a partisan conversation. We did not want to have a rending of garments or pulling of hair. We wanted to ask some of the basic, deep, fundamental questions that this period posed. We know that we're engaged in many, many ways in a struggle over the shape and future and nature of liberal democracy in the United States and around the world. We hear people talk not just about policies which we might like or not like. Someone might like a tax bill, someone might not like a health bill, but we hear about the norms of constitutional governance, the checks and balances, the unwritten rules that bind a democracy together under stress. And we wanted to go deeper on that question, to ask what it is that we're looking at and living through. What, if anything, should be done about it? Are there, in fact, reforms? Are there steps that can be taken to reweave some of the fabrics of our democratic system? And very importantly, given that these concerns have been raised across the political spectrum, what, if anything, is the political moment and the political configuration that could actually allow there to be positive change? At a time of great polarization, hyperpartisanship, which we've lived through for the last decade or two, are there actually ways in which the seismic shifts of the past year or past year or two actually create new opportunities? We're very, very appreciative to all of you for being here. I want to thank my colleagues at the Brennan Center, Vivian Watts, Janine Plant-Churlin, Melanie O'Keefe, Elizabeth Martin, Jessica Katzen, who staged this event. And I want to thank our panelists and moderator, to whom I will turn it over, even though he needs little, if any, introduction. George Stephanopoulos is the chief anchor of ABC News. He is the host of Good Morning America and also the host of This Week, the preeminent Sunday talk show, which I know has had record viewership in this intense period. We're really thrilled to have you here, George, an old friend of mine, and we're really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Thanks to all of you. And thank you most of all, Michael, for really just doing my job. You framed the discussion so perfectly. We're going to dig right in. We've got the perfect panel to do it with. Emily Bazelon, staff writer for the New York. You can cheer, that's okay. For the New York Times Magazine, lecturer at Yale Law School and co-host of Slate's Political Gabfest, Preet Bharara. You all know him now at NYU, now professor. Former U.S. Attorney, Southern District of New York, host of the Stay Tuned podcast, and I was glad I could do a little bit more. Whenever Preet's on my show, the shorthand is the U.S. Attorney fired by President Trump. And John Podhoretz, editor of Commentary Magazine, also a wonderful columnist for the New York Post. And as I said, Emily, let me start with you, because I think Michael did frame up the discussion well. And you wrote an article, I think it was back in July in the New York Times Magazine, which was titled, "How Do We Contend with Trump's Defiance of Norms?" And I wonder if you can just start out by defining that. I mean, defining what you think he's done, and then I added to that, is it as bad as you feared?
Right. So I went to law school like some of you, and that trained me to think mostly about laws and rules and the formal written down instructions that the government gives us, or that we demand from the government, that organize our behavior, that are the basic sort of architecture of society. It struck me, and not just me, obviously, that in this era of President Trump, laws haven't done the work that we, I think, need to do to maintain all of the elements of our liberal democracy that are really crucial. And so that was why over the summer I started trying to think of norms, which to me are softer. They erode. We talk about breaking a rule, snapping a rule, but norms sort of fade away like sand. And yet they're extremely precious. We rely on them all the time. There's no way we can write down every standard of behavior that we want people in the government, in particular the president, to follow. And so that's why I think we're focused on this right now as we watch standards of behavior kind of slip away, or sometimes the president kind of blows right through them. But it also, I think, shows what a tricky subject this is, because when you don't write rules down, then it's not clear exactly what they are, whether they mean the same thing to everyone. And of course, sometimes norms are stultifying. They can prevent institutions from changing. They can prevent young people from challenging old people. So it's not as if a norm is like a simple thing. Has it been as bad as I think? Well, the kind of basic structure of the democracy is holding. Forgive this metaphor, but I have often thought, particularly in the last year, of our Constitution as like the basement of an old creaky building, like where the pipes are and the supports that's holding everything up. And sometimes, in my lifetime, we've tapped on various pipes and given stress tests to make sure that they still hold, and had interesting conversations about a norm. Is the Independent Counsel Act the right way to think about investigating the executive? I think in the last year, we've seen a lot of those pipes get kicked in the shins. And that makes me feel very aware of some of the weaknesses in the Constitution, things it doesn't directly address, wasn't set up to think about when it was written, which is a long time ago now. So maybe we can get into some of those
I was just
specifics.
thinking, it just made me think, one of the things I think it wasn't perfectly set up to address is something that we've been dealing with from the beginning with President Trump. And I want to address this to you, John. You're a journalist as well. But I think one of the things that I found most difficult to contend with over the last now year and a half is the president often, you can even say more often than not, doesn't particularly seem to care whether or not what he's saying is true. And it's
a very nice way of putting it.
Well, it's one way of putting it, but it actually leads to, and you've seen that our system actually doesn't know how to handle it. It's sort of based on the idea that, we all know presidents lie, presidents have lied throughout history, presidents lie all the time, but they kind of tip their hat towards the truth while they're doing it. That hasn't happened here.
Right. Well, in my experience, I had a very brief experience in government, but in my experience as an analyst and a student and observer of American politics, I would say that presidents and their staffs and their speechwriters and their press secretaries have gone to unbelievable lengths, even if they're being sophistic or, Talmudic in the worst possible sense of the term, to make what the president says, or to have statements come out from the White House in the name of the president that conform with the truth in the most basic sense. In other words, it could be spun wrong, it can be, a false representation, but that the factual basis of what is being said, people just strain to make sure that there are hard supports for that. I was briefly a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan, and the amount of research checking, double checking, triple checking to make sure that every word that was said by the president was defensible, so that if anyone said, well, what he said was not true, you could say, aha, see, in 1874 there was an article that said X, Y, and Z, and it would fit. So clearly this White House has blown through that norm, right? And I'm not even talking about whether or not he doesn't care about the truth. I mean, there is no structure in place in which to provide any ballast when he does not conform to the truth, in an effort to kind of provide an architecture so that other people in the administration, not just he, but the vice president or his press secretary, I mean, George had to stand at that podium, so that he would have something, they could have something to say so that they wouldn't have to stand there and double down on the lie. And I would say that the interesting problem with the alteration of the structure of norms, though, is that he is not breaking them. He is reflecting the fact that the norms broke down. His election is a response and a result of very long-term trends in American life, in American public life, in American academic life, about how we handle things like the truth. If all of that ground had not been softened up in ways that we weren't even aware were going on, he could not have survived 5 minutes of the primary process, let alone a general election cycle. So many people have, that's where I would disagree with you, Emily. I mean, those pipes have been kicked so often for so long, not the institutional supports, of our Constitution, but in our general social order, that someone who comes along to be a disruptor can only be a disruptor if much of what he argues has already been accepted by the people that he was making the argument to. Basically that it's all nonsense, everybody's a liar, everybody's a cheat, both parties stink, and if I'm not telling you the truth, don't worry, everybody before me didn't tell the truth either. Deep cynicism that he exploited but did not create.
It's interesting you bring that up, and it gets us to Preet as well, that the one place that he and his team may be forced to tell the truth eventually is when they're under investigation, when they're questioned by Robert Mueller, when they're questioned under oath in the Congress. And that's a whole other area where it seems like our norms have been under stress. When you look at the basket of issues underneath the investigation and the rule of law, how he's dealt with his own Justice Department, I think of how many, we use the word unprecedented all the time. The day that he put out a tweet attacking his own attorney general for buckling on the Russia investigation.
More than once.
More than once, yeah. But you would normally think, under the norms of everything we've known in all of our lifetimes, within 3, 4, maybe 5 hours, the attorney general is gone. He's still there today.
Yeah, it beats the hell out of me. I don't know. So I have a number of reactions to that question and to other things that have been said. And this issue, I think some people we haven't had a robust discussion about this thing called norms, I think, in a long time, because people observe them. And you think that when you start to talk about it, whose norm? Is it the Cheers guy? Which norm are we talking about?
We got some good tweets.
But yes, we did, and the pictures of all the famous people named Norm. Truth matters. And what John was talking about, I was sitting here, and I hadn't thought of it this way before, about how not only does the president seem to have an interesting relationship with the truth and an interesting feeling about the truth, but as you point out, not even a structure to sort of figure out a way to make something the president said possibly true. And we have literally, so I was thinking back to my time as the U.S. attorney, and we literally, prosecuted criminals who knew better than that. So, for example, we prosecuted people for insider trading sometimes, who bought a stock based on an inside tip that was unlawful, and they traded on the stock tip, and even they had someone put in the file after the fact some research that would purport to justify the trade, because maybe it's nice to have something that suggests that what they did was true. Donald Trump doesn't even do that. And he's the president of the United States. the point about what he's doing in the sphere that I have some familiarity with, is relatively shocking. He's defied every single normal way that the Justice Department operates. And I also wanted to say one caveat to that. I agree with Emily, and her piece was excellent, and you should read it. This idea that as an automatic matter, just because you're defying some norm or you're breaking some precedent, it's automatically bad, that actually drives me a little bit crazy. And there's a lot of reporting that I read, and I know it's a shorthand, but the mere fact that someone does something that's unprecedented, to my mind, doesn't make it bad. In fact, there are tremendously wonderful things that happen because they're unprecedented. As Emily points out, there's all sorts of bad things that happen if you robotically and automatically subject yourself to norms. There are norms of racism in certain communities. There are norms where there are laws that allow interracial marriage, but there have been times where one could say that the norm in a particular community was no interracial marriage, and that's not a good thing. So when we ask the question about Donald Trump and how he's acting, there's some rules that he's broken that I think are not terrible. He speaks more bluntly than other people spoke during the campaign. He's more sort of natural in his, I don't mean to say all these terrific things about the guy who fired me, but these things happen to be true. The question is, how far has he gone in the opposite direction? And what is the quality and necessity of the norm that he is breaking? So here, when you're talking about the Justice Department, I'm relatively, unconcerned compared to all the thousands of things to be concerned about with the fact that the President of the United States, in the example you gave, says incredibly derogatory things about his own Attorney General, which breaks a norm and is not a good idea generally for morale of that person and the people who serve under him. But then other people are also breaking. The norm in that case would be you don't show up for work the next day because you have some honor about yourself and you have some personal pride. Both of those things have been broken. I don't think that's great, but I'm less concerned about that than I am about Donald Trump saying things like, to Jim Comey, and I credit this, lay off of Michael Flynn, saying to Jeff Sessions, is there a way we can do something different with Joe Arpaio? Or telling people in tweets, and who knows what he's saying in private conversation. I mean, he's saying publicly that the DNC should be investigated, that Hillary Clinton should be investigated, and maybe these things should happen, but the president should not be saying them. And in my own personal experience, it's not the biggest thing in the world, but typically sitting presidents who have property and business interests in a particular jurisdiction that some people are saying should be investigated by the United States Attorney, don't call up the United States Attorney, from time to time to shoot the breeze. That's violating a norm, it's violating a guideline, it's violating all sorts of things. And so my concern over time is that he is breaking down what should be an important wall between law enforcement and politics.
And I want to bring it to Emily, a different question to Emily after this, but first just to follow up with you, since you've had this personal experience of being on the other end of the phone call and then saying, I'm not going to pick up the phone. Based on that limited experience, do you think he doesn't know the norm, doesn't care, or knows exactly what he's doing?
I think he knows what he's doing, and I think we do a disfavor to truth and the problems we're seeing when we infantilize him and when we say he doesn't know what he's doing, he's new to this. I think Paul Ryan said that once, and I think I said this on your show. Donald Trump knew well enough what the norm was of a separation between politics and law enforcement to be able to exploit a particular event that happened last year. And that event was the current Attorney General, the then Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, met on the tarmac of an airport with Bill Clinton, whose wife was being investigated by the FBI. Now, that was a norm that was violated and probably was not a great idea for everyone concerned, and particularly for Bill Clinton. And Donald Trump went from rally after rally after rally yelling about that and saying, there's not enough to talk about with your grandkids, 30 minutes, of course they must have talked about the investigation. So he knew that was wrong. And so when he exploits a particular violation of a norm, there's nothing unlawful about that conversation happening, and then people suggest that they can excuse him for being new to all this, I find that to be insulting.
And then that's part of the question I'm bringing down, and then John weigh in as well. Is the problem that we don't have the right laws to deal with this, or we don't have the will, or at least the legislative branch right now doesn't have the will to make a big deal out of the laws that might be being violated?
Well, both, right? I mean, there's some laws that are missing, like The emoluments clause is really old, has never really been enforced, doesn't seem to be doing the job of constraining the behavior of an executive who is flaunting the spirit, at least, of that clause in a way. And again, there's a norm, and I think it's clear that Trump doesn't care, and that turns out to be okay in the course of his presidency. I think there's a whole interesting conversation about whether our laws regarding independent investigations of a presidential campaign, of the president and his family, whether they're strong enough. That's like one thing that's holding, thanks to Jeff Sessions not leaving his job. There are many kind of ironies in that one, but it's an important one. And yet, clearly, the fact that the Republican-led Congress has not been super eager to challenge the president is a huge part of this story. It would be a completely different picture if the Republicans and president were going against their own political good. Hard to imagine, but that is one sort of theoretical scenario. Or if you had Democrats in Congress who are very eager to fight with the president. And I do think the supine nature of Congress in all of this is historically going to be something that we look back on as having been tremendously important. And if you think of Congress as the second branch, having its independent, separate institutional prerogatives, then maybe it's surprising that Congress has been so willing to kind of cave.
I mean, I would just say, to take this slightly out of the, specific and into the larger social and philosophical realms, that I've been having a dispute with people sometimes that I'm on MSNBC with, who say, we can't normalize this behavior. We can't normalize it. This is not normal. And my response to it is, the president makes it normal. He got 63 million votes. We sit here and say, president shouldn't do this, and every president gets to define what his presidency is with the strength of having won 30 states and 304 electoral votes. And as it turns out, if he wants to violate norms, he can violate norms. And I would point out that when Barack Obama in 2014 and 2015 did particularly in relation to DACA and the Dreamers, when he actually sort of made what I believe to be an extra constitutional decision to use the presidency to grant this specialized status, that one of the reasons that Republicans in Congress, who were, by the way, then in the majority in Congress, screamed and yelled and said this was wrong and it was bad. But given the fact that the only real remedy that they could have would have been to impeach him and then convict him and throw him from office, which seemed too extreme a measure, that you see there how a president redefines a norm because of his position as the only person in the country for whom everyone gets to vote.
He doesn't only exploit, in this situation, the weaknesses of our legal system or our political system. I mean, this is something I think about every day with the job that we do. The volume and the velocity of the kind of disruption he's unleashed makes it, I don't want to use the word impossible because that's letting myself and others off the hook, but makes it very, very difficult to give every single disruption the amount of attention it deserves so people understand what's happening.
And that is a signal and noise problem, like to use Nate Silver's term, because half, 3/4 of these are just nonsense. And it turns out what's interesting is that the nonsense is often far more entertaining than anything serious. So, I mean, we can spend 3 weeks talking about Colin Kaepernick, which it turns out is something that everybody, or kneeling at a football game, because that is something that everybody in America can come up with an instant opinion of. It's like, I'm a movie critic. Movie critics have no standing. Everyone's opinion is equal, right? So everyone's opinion of whether Colin Kaepernick should kneel or not, and whether players should kneel.
How about one, and I'll put this to Preet. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to finish then you have cases that are much more complicated that people aren't that interested in, but are much more important. But you are going to cover the football kneeling because that's what most people are more, the culture war stuff, over which he has very little legislative or social influence in that sense, is much more dazzling and hypnotic than the stuff that, say, you guys think we should be paying attention to in public policy terms, as do I.
Well, there's,
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think if part of the thing to think about, whether you're in this audience or you're otherwise just concerned about what's going on in the country, is you do have to pick and choose. And you have to separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of what to be concerned about. I once, on Twitter, I sent out a tweet after Donald Trump said something like, he said at some fundraiser or something, the White House is a dump. Is something like that, right? Is that what he said? And
he said he didn't say it later, but yeah.
First of all, it's true. Yeah. First of all, it's not. It's very nice. Second of all, I just tweeted, this is not in the top 50 most important things that we should be concerned about or outraged about our country. And then I got a number, dozens and dozens of responses like, don't tell us what we can't be outraged about. I can multitask in my outraging. and all sorts of anger at me because I was just trying to sort of set out a hierarchy of concern. But it does distract you. And I think the importance, and I'm glad to the Brennan Center for hosting an event like this to allow us to sort of suggest modestly and respectfully that there are some things that are not only just peculiar to the violating of norms and etiquette, and not only just particular to this president, but that will have potentially a lasting effect on democracy and rule of law and balance of powers and those sorts of things that can last far into the future.
Let me throw out one and see Emily, what you think of this, because I remember the morning it happened, I thought it was one of the most jaw-dropping things that ever happened. Quite early in the term, Saturday morning, the president had been obviously watching Fox and Friends and decided to send out that tweet saying Barack Obama ordered the wiretapping of Trump Tower. And I remember sitting at home and being shocked. He just accused his predecessor of a felony, of one of the worst crimes a president could ever commit, and never explained it, and it drifted for months.
Right, because it seems like if a president would say such a thing, he would be held to some sort of standard of research and support that John was talking about. Look, I think we could spend a lot of time deciding what our own hierarchies of concern are, and it's not that surprising that, we might, as people who are super thinking about the rule of law and these structural questions, have a different ranking than some of the people who you're getting comments from on social media. But I also think these things are tied together, right? And one of the things that Donald Trump is really good at is figuring out how to divide people. So his tweet, I think that was a tweet about President Obama, is a way of signaling to his base that he is with them, recalling a foe that he wishes he still had, right? It's why we're still hearing endlessly about crooked Hillary, because it's much better for him if he has like an obvious bad person to hold up there and run against, even though, like, of course, there's no campaign anymore. And I think that actually ties directly to the Colin Kaepernick moments, which were incredibly divisive, especially dividing along lines of race, which is, again, one of his favorite things. And I think we don't know now which of those moments actually matter more. It may be that we'll look back on this presidency as a moment in which racial division was not just normalized, but kind of affirmed and celebrated. And that will turn out to be one of the most enduring and important legacies of this presidency to our detriment. And so I feel nervous about dismissing some norm breaking as sort of like, oh, he's throwing that to the commoners, look at them like chasing that shiny object. There is a lot of chasing of shiny objects, and we in the press are really struggling about what counts and what's what. But I also think that when things resonate and everyone's talking about them, because everyone can have an opinion and it's easy, that's a moment when Trump is essentially winning. He's accomplishing his goals, and that's where.
Yet I wonder if yesterday's gives us one piece of data that perhaps it doesn't work. He wins in the short term, but not in the long term. You talk about, is his legacy going to be division? John, one of the things we saw in the elections yesterday, maybe the answer is politics. You go downstate delegate races in the state of Virginia, the most diverse group of delegates ever elected.
Right. Well, I think that is an obvious answer to this cultural quagmire that is almost beyond politics to deal with. I don't disagree with you about what you said about Colin Kaepernick. My concern is sort of deeper and in some ways way more pessimistic, which is that I think we have, in ways that I certainly myself did not diagnose before 2014 or 2015, that we are in as as a society, we are moving in a direction in which our respect not only for political norms, but for the fact that there are sort of unambiguous truths that we should all be able to agree on, even if they're very basic. That we are moving into a world in which people are literally going to decide that they believe in this set of facts, and another bunch of people are going to think that they believe in another set of facts. And the politics has the advantage of having these moments in time at which decisions are adjudicated, right? So elections happen, people win, other people don't win, and you can then, when the dust clears, you can say, okay, well, there is a serious trend here where people are forced to pick and choose. In the cultural battles, the war is never ended. It can't end because there's no truce. No one calls a truce. Things settle down, or sometimes they bubble up again. And if we are at a time at which people do not believe in politics as much and believe much more in the efficacy and force of these cultural squabbles, we are getting ourselves we are walking into a trap that we are not going to be able to get out of. That's why it's so refreshing. Look, I'm a conservative and I'm a Republican, and I don't have that much of whatever happens in Virginia, I'm not like celebrating what happened in Virginia, but at least it's a moment in time in which a decision is made. You can say, okay, well, we're not all just going to say, well, in the next election, maybe they'll lose the House, maybe they won't, maybe they'll lose the Senate, and then this will happen. Something happens, and then reality resets itself with that knowledge. It's incredibly refreshing.
And I wonder what
elections.
Yeah, because all we've done is talk about one special election in Virginia, in Georgia, in which $40 million was spent, and this bizarre election in Alabama and all of that. But this is a real moment when the election is set, and we're going to have one in November of 2018, and that will be the moment at which the American people, in some aggregate way, will be able to tell us what they think of what has happened since the 2016 election.
In 2018, we'll have another in 2020, but and we also have a special prosecutor doing his job right now. And I'll bring this question to you, Preet. I mean, we don't know what he's going to find. It seems like the beginning of a process, not the end of it. But in this environment that John is talking about, I mean, is Robert Mueller, depending on what he finds, the way out of the trap, or is he caught in the trap? And that his work might not be seen in the same way that it would have been seen 10, 15, 20 years ago?
I think he's absolutely caught in the trap. And I think one of the problems with certain kinds of norms being violated, like by name mocking particular judges if you don't agree with their decision that relates to your policy or to your associates, or you in advance have a sort of campaign to undercut the credibility of someone, whatever you think of what brought. Look, we should not put these people on pedestals. Robert Mueller is a human, as far as I'm aware, and and he's a tremendously accomplished, a bipartisan, nonpartisan figure. And this is a guy who was the FBI director for 10 years, and then rather than find someone else when his term was over among the 320 million wonderful people in the United States of America, Democrats and Republicans together voted 100-0 to change the law to allow him to serve 2 years longer. So whatever you think about what he's doing now, I literally could not come up with a figure who would be more likely to generate, I think, respect and goodwill from both sides. That is being undercut now. And yet, I mean, Newt Gingrich, on the day that he was appointed, said, basically, hallelujah, everyone should calm down. He's a consummate professional. Then he starts doing his job, and then political considerations take over, and he's joined the chorus of voices saying terrible things about Bob Mueller. But I should also say, it's not just, it's a bipartisan problem. And my concern from where I sit, or where I used to sit, is people, it is a natural thing, but it's been taken to an extreme, for people to want to substitute their political preference for legal judgment or rule of law. And so some of the very same people, without much knowledge of the facts or the law, went to rallies in the fall of last year chanting "lock her up" about Hillary. And that's because largely they didn't like her and didn't like her policies. I don't think it was an astute judgment about the law. And you know what? A lot of people who complained about that are now on the other side, who are saying, and I'm not saying there's no basis for it, just like there was not zero basis for saying the things about Hillary because it was a real investigation, are now saying the equivalent of lock him up, he must be impeached, when they know similarly little about the law and the facts. I mean, more stuff is coming out now. And maybe it's not possible for people to be neutral about these things when the targets of I don't know if this is true, when the targets of the investigation are the President of the United States or the potential President of the United States, that political preference takes over because people have such a deep investment in who their president is going to be. But I worry that no matter what Robert Mueller does, to go to your question, there's going to be 100 million people who are going to say, or 60 million people who are going to say, hallelujah, if he brings a particular kind of charge, and another 60 million saying he's the devil, and the reverse is also true. And so I don't know how we get to a point where people will accept his judgment.
I just don't think that that's new. I mean, when Kenneth Starr, when Monica Lewinsky emerged in 1998 and he was an independent counsel, there was a very deliberate and specific effort to tarnish his reputation, to call him a political and religious fanatic, to say that this was the politicization of an effort to oust Bill Clinton illegitimately, and that was 20 years ago. So I don't think that
But with John, there was a difference, though. I mean, having lived through it, and from a very particular perspective, the Whitewater investigation started in 1990, late 93, early 1994. A different special prosecutor started the investigation, finished the investigation. After he finished the investigation, was fired by a 3-judge panel. Ken Starr started in 1994. 4 years later, came upon Monica Lewinsky. It had nothing to do with what he started with. So it wasn't at the beginning of the process.
No, of course not.
And then there was
of course not, but I'm saying that's
on getting rid of the independent counsel statute because it was seen as having gone too far. Sorry.
Right. No. All I was going to say is that your interpretation. I'm not defending Ken Starr or the investigation. All I'm saying is that this circumstance where you're talking about legal investigations of the president, they are necessarily political. It's why I think the founders envisioned that the president, I believe, would be in the docket in Congress more than ever proved to be the case. I think there's every reason to believe, if you read the parts of the Constitution dealing with impeachment, that the notion that he would have to make a case for himself because he couldn't obviously investigate, since all the powers of the executive branch inhere in him personally, somebody else was going to have to take up the cudgel against him if he went rogue. And just because it's only happened twice doesn't mean that it shouldn't have happened way more often. But a norm was established.
But actually, there's a new norm now. It's talked about much more openly now since the impeachment of President Clinton. I mean, every president since Clinton, 2 of them, have had some discussion about impeachment. And there have been bills introduced, and it's not forbidden anymore. It's not something you don't think about at all.
It hasn't saved us, though, from the partisan dilemma we're struggling with, right? Because every time it comes up in this very charged and partisan way. And so that if the Democrats take a House of Congress, that will happen again. And I think what you're sort of fearing legitimately is that no matter what Robert Mueller has found, there is going to be a percentage of the country which is only watching media that is denouncing Robert Mueller and will not believe that it's legitimate, whatever Mueller is doing, right? And that there's this tension. There's the base, there's conservative media propping up the base, and then there are the Republicans in Congress who it's hard to expect them to move while their base is over 80% in favor of Trump.
I think something that's been hinted at on the panel is that when one party, particularly if it's someone like the President of the United States, who is the head of the executive branch, decides to violate norms and behave in a way that has never been seen before, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. It has consequences and ripple effects, and other people start to do things too. So when you ask the question, well, there's a lot more talk about impeachment than there used to be. Well, maybe it's because this guy is acting, particularly crazy, is causing other people to do different things. I think the behavior of the President of the United States has caused another norm to be broken, and I know there's been leaking out of the White House in prior administrations, and maybe you'll correct me historically. It seems to be dramatically more in a particular regard, and there's leaking from people who are accused of being part of the deep state, which I don't really believe in, but lots of other people start behaving in a different way. So during the campaign, Donald Trump starts speaking in a particularly, base way, And then the next day, Marco Rubio was talking about his hands and making other references to his body parts. So if you have a bunch of normal playing kids in a sandbox and you introduce an element of craziness, and that one kid starts kicking sand in the, yes, I'm calling all of Congress children, and one kid starts kicking sand and misbehaving, what likely is going to happen is not that everyone else is going to continue to behave like a perfectly well-mannered child. Other people are going to start acting up also. And that will sometimes happen in the press. It will sometimes happen in the president's own cabinet. It's happening in the Congress. I mean, you know, Bob Corker is using language on Twitter referring to the president and the White House as being adult daycare. That's a violation of a norm too, but it's in response to something else. So there are ripple effects.
Well,
to these things.
that's exactly my fear, which is that once we do not have a lot of experience in American society of things liberating themselves, or sort of passions or ids liberate and then getting restrained again. We don't restrain ourselves. We open up more and more and more, and this is precisely the problem. It's not just that, you know, a president that follows Trump will, you know, open a hotel and have an ad on Fox News for his hotel. It's that the entirety of the political system will start to follow the comportment of the president for a very good reason. Again, he's the only person in this country that everybody votes for. You know, I thought in 1994, one of the interesting things that we discovered, or that the right, I would say, discovered in 95 after the Republicans took over Congress, was that Newt Gingrich got himself into a mindset in which he thought that he and the president were sort of equal players. And Newt Gingrich got 110,000 votes in a district in Georgia, and Bill Clinton had gotten, I don't know, what was it, 47 million votes. Like, these guys were not equal. And the press made him think that they were equal. And the minute that when Clinton trained his fire on Gingrich was destroyed. It took 3 years for Gingrich to be ousted. But, you know, I think what you see in these circumstances is the power of the presidency in a divided country is maybe even grander than it would be in a country that was less divided and calmer. Because not only can he motivate his own people to be like him, but the general response will be, we can't unilaterally disarm. He uses these horrible techniques. We've got to deploy them against him to get him out. So both sides have a reason to sort of go down into the sandbox and stay there. And that's where we might find ourselves conducting our political lives unless something very significant changes in the next 2 years.
Or unless you change the minds of the people that are watching. And that's one of the questions that came in. Barbara, hope I pronounced your name correctly, Barbara Wecker. And I'll just throw this out to the panel. Anybody who wants to pick it up. How would you convey an appreciation for the rule of law, which is the key element of our democracy, to the folks who make up the Trump base?
They love the rule of law. There was a time, this is the bizarre thing. I mean, again, I may sound naive to all of you here, but you know, when the Tea Party emerged, there were two aspects of it. One of the main aspects of the Tea Party was, I'm walking around with the Constitution. I have a pocket Constitution. I worship and revere this document. That was the general comportment of Tea Party rallies and things like that. Turns out they didn't mean it, but it looked good.
There are parts of it they still are attached to.
The 10th Amendment. Yeah, Second Amendment. But I'm just saying, they didn't really mean it. They sort of meant it as long as it meant what they wanted it to mean.
Well, the Constitution is like the Bible. You find to know what you're looking for.
Yeah, exactly. Right? So there was reverence. There was this moment when, when most of the people who voted for Trump were expressing great reverence for the founders and the founding documents of the United States, and it wasn't that long ago.
So I think one answer to this that relates back to this problem of Trump dragging everyone to the sandbox is that we're seeing a terribly ineffective way of responding to a bully. So in the movies, right, the bully, there's one person heroically stands up to the bully, punches the bully in the nose and vanquishes them. This is like the plot of Back to the Future, among other 80s films that I am fond of. That is not how it works in real life. In real life, the community, the group, has to decide at some point that they've had enough and figure out a dignified, restrained way that may involve ostracizing the bully as a way of responding. So to me, the problem with Bob Corker and Marco Rubio kind of descending to the level of Trump's boorish speech is that it just is a failure. It makes them much smaller, it diminishes our overall discourse, and it doesn't get the job done. It's only going to be when a lot of people come together and reject this new norm that we'll see a shift. And so to me, one of the significances of the election results last night is a signal from the voters that perhaps some of the Republicans in DC will behoove them to pay attention to, that these new norms are not so great and everyone isn't down for them, and there are a bunch of people who voted for Donald Trump or stayed home last year who are not really excited about doing that again.
So one person who's doing that, in a manner of speaking, is Senator Jeff Flake from Arizona,
But
who
again,
gave a speech
by himself.
By himself, but
As he's leaving the Senate.
As
Yes,
he's leaving.
as he leaves.
He's going to be the guest on my podcast tomorrow. You should listen.
All over the place. It's like every time I open the
Jeff Flake
newspaper,
is the king of all media.
I
don't know.
have a podcast too, by the way.
We should do a thing.
I have two.
And all of you
If you're
listening on the
mentioning
radio, I actually have to
podcasts,
do a
that's all
piece
I'm
of
saying.
business here. All of you listening on the radio, this is NYU Law School's Brennan Center for Justice program. We're talking to Emily Bazelon, Preet Bharara, John Podhoretz. Keep going. Go ahead.
But I just wonder what, and we had this conversation, which you'll listen to, but I wonder what you think about this idea of how the community comes. I mean, the community doesn't simultaneously all come together like random molecules forming into something new.
Well, the community of Washington, Republicans in Washington, could come together. Now, again,
It has to begin somewhere, right? Like, so with Jeff Flake, do you think that Jeff Flake, because I don't know yet, do you think that Jeff Flake, speech and commentary, and he went pretty high, and it was a lofty speech about norms, and he used a lot of language.
Lots of high road.
Lots of high road. Does that mean something or not?
it means something, but I don't think that it has yet shown to be the canary in the coal mine or auguring some broader shift. And again, perhaps it is unrealistic to expect this at a moment when the base support for Trump is still so high, right? It's these things, someone has to affect someone else in a way that makes the change, and it's a little tough on elected politicians to be, selflessly, essentially running themselves off the electoral stage, which is what Jeff Flake just did.
And it seems like what's been happening right now in Washington, we don't know if the election yesterday will change it at all, but the Republicans have made some sort of a calculation. Whatever they think of President Trump privately, we have to stick together at least until we pass this tax bill, which, it's not just the shiny objects, the tweets that have perhaps broken some norms. And this is something that I kind of can't get over, and I'll throw it to you first. John, when you think about right now a major tax bill is before the Congress, the President of the United States has never released his taxes. From the portions of his tax returns over the last 30 years that have been released, it seems like the bill before the Congress now is tailor-made as a benefit for Donald Trump, whether it's the pass-through, most of his money comes through pass-throughs. That's going down to 25%. The estate tax, alternative minimum tax, we know that was the other tax that he paid. There was even one I read about today, which I couldn't believe. For the kind of investments he has in the pass-throughs, everybody else will lose the state and local tax deduction, except for people who make money from pass-throughs like that. How is that possible?
I wish I could. It's not funny, right? It's not funny,
No.
and yet it shows you how quickly this can happen. My view is, we don't know how it happened, and we don't know who wrote what, and it's very odd because he today apparently in a call to Democratic senators said he didn't like the Republican bill that has all this.
No, and he said he called his
wonderful-
accountant, and believe me, I'm going to get hurt by this. It's just crazy.
Yeah, right. So I think the interesting political situation that Republicans find themselves in, and believe me, I've spent 2 years urging them to stand up and talk, and like I know. So, but the thing is that they are caught in a classic pincer situation, right? So if you look at the polls, so 33% of the public approves of Trump, or 33 to 38% approves of Trump, and we can assume that most of those people approve of him pretty heartily. And they constitute 60 to 70, 80% of the voters that every one of these people have in their districts or more. And then 57% disapprove, And most of those, it appears, are moving into severe disapproval. So they don't have enough people in their base, unless they're in a 20-plus Trump district. They don't have enough, or senators, let's say, or whatever, out of states. They don't have enough people in their base or out of their base who will support them to justify the loss of the people who would be angry at them, which is the Jeff Flake story. So people don't commit career suicide in front of you. This calculation is very prudent, and it's up to the American people to make it possible for Republican politicians to oppose Trump, which I am reasonably certain at least half of the elected officials in Washington who are Republicans would really like to do. They didn't want him. Remember, 55% of Republican voters did not vote for Trump in the primaries. I know that sounds, like, whatever, but it's serious. Like, he only got 45% of the Republican vote. This isn't who they got elected to serve. That wasn't their idea, but they can't kill them, and if Jeff Flake's gonna leave because it's not gonna work out for him, and it's not as though he's gonna be replaced by anybody who isn't more he's gonna be replaced by somebody who was more pro-Trump than he is, and there is the Republican situation in chrysalis. They're trapped. Everything they do will drag them down if they oppose him, and everything they do will drag him down if they support him, and things go south, which I think
unless the message they take from yesterday's election, again, it's one set of elections, is that only Trump can get away with being Trump. That otherwise it doesn't work.
Right. But Ed Gillespie, who was the guy who lost in Virginia last night, is as mainstream a conservative Republican as there possibly could be, and he tried to run as a non-Trump for 3 months, and then he flipped and tried to run as a very light Trump. It's Trump but light, but not that Trump, and that didn't work either. And he was, given the margin of the election, I think it's pretty clear that he never really had a prayer. So the real issue is, did he not know that? And could he have stayed with his non-Trump message and, been sort of like a sacrificial lamb to the idea that the party couldn't win? I think he's actually in some ways done the party a service by having shown that the Trump message won't carry, because at least then maybe there is hope that there will be some generation of an independent attitude. But, it's like in the end, they're going to sink and fall with him. They got no choice. That's the way things go. I don't know that's ever not been true of a politician in a party. There are very few situations like Marjorie Margolis-Menzvinsky, who was a congresswoman from Pennsylvania in 1983, who cast the deciding vote in the tax increase with the full knowledge that it was going to mean that she was going to lose her election.
Well, except the counter-argument to that, I guess, would be that in, 1973, enough Republicans decided that they weren't going to go down with Richard Nixon.
Only
and
after
they did,
Richard
but they
Nixon's
did.
approval rating slipped to
Yeah.
like 55% among Republicans, right? I feel compelled to bring up two Supreme Court cases this term, which could deeply affect our elections. So we've been talking about elections as things that we feel we can rely on and trust. And last night was an example of high turnout. There's a lot of talk about how the Virginia House of Delegates, with these, I assume, still undecided seats, was gerrymandered to be totally foolproof for Republicans to hold control forever, and maybe they won't, so maybe gerrymandering doesn't matter so much anymore. It does matter a great deal, and the Supreme Court will either open the door to courts refereeing gerrymanders. Am I doing that?
Nope.
I didn't really need a roll of thunder.
It's a good soundtrack for the game.
I scared myself.
It's not the norm.
Right. So the Supreme Court has a case about a gerrymander in the state assembly in Wisconsin. And there has been, to this very day, no real court refereeing of political gerrymandering. Yes, for racial gerrymanderings, court get involved, not for political gerrymandering. What we have now, again, is this sort of shifting of norms. Gerrymandering's been around forever, beginning of the 18th century. The guy's name was actually Gary.
Yeah. Gary, right.
Supposedly, right? But we have this increasingly sophisticated technology that allows votes to be distributed with incredible precision, and we have people willing to use that. The Wisconsin Republicans had a special secret map room. They had folks working in it for months. They didn't let the Democrats in to see what was happening. They were really hardcore about it, and it worked. They have won 3 elections since then with larger margins than they should have gotten based on how many votes they got statewide. That decision will matter a lot, potentially. And then there's another Supreme Court case that just got delayed in the calendar, but will be with us soon enough, about Ohio's rules for taking people off the registration rolls. If that's something that becomes much easier to do, that is going to change the shape of our electorate. In general, when you make it harder for people to vote and register, that benefits Republicans. When you make it easier, that benefits Democrats.
Okay, so can I ask you can I challenge you on a norms question?
Please.
So the reason that this is only coming up now and has been something that no one ever challenged is that the Constitution says that the state shall have the right to you know
district.
The language better than I,
Yeah.
right, to the time, manner, and nature or something of
They are in
elections.
charge of redistricting.
Right, but they're in charge of elections, period, in the states. And there is the Constitution sees no role for any other body to interfere in state elections, period. That is what the Constitution says. So political gerrymandering is deeply offensive on its surface, but the way to improve it is to, kick Scott Walker out and get a Democratic governor who won't approve X, Y, or Z or something. It's not. So is that a violation of a norm for political gerrymandering to be overturned by the Supreme Court? I would say that's an arguable thing to argue.
So 2 things. One is that the cleanest answer are these nonpartisan commissions that some states have set up, because then the state is changing its own redistricting process, and that is the sort of the easiest answer within the framework of the Constitution. The longer answer that gives the Supreme Court a role is that the court began taking a role for itself in the 60s with the one-person, one-vote cases, right? The idea of equal apportionment. It used to be that you had 30 people in Vermont with a state rep and 100,000 people in Vermont with a state rep, and that was okay for a really long time, and it also perpetuated segregation in the South. And the Supreme Court ended that in decisions that we celebrate. We think of one-person, one-vote now as part of our constitutional canon. We also, perhaps more controversially, but we certainly have made room for actions against racial gerrymandering. And so if you think of that body of law, then that question of whether this is a huge norm breaking for the Supreme Court to open the political gerrymandering door might look a little different.
I would only offer, I'm not a lawyer or a law professor or a prosecutor, I would only offer the argument that those cases were decided with reference to amendments of equal power to the article, which is Article 2, that lays out the rules about states and their rights in districting. And it's not clear to me if 14th Amendment, what role that would play in political gerrymandering, which is simply about how districts are drawn.
Right, well then you have to decide whether
Right.
you are willing to make room for Justice Kennedy's idea, that's the First Amendment, that's also at issue here, that politically people are being penalized for their identity in a way that has to do with their freedom of association and speech. So you can buy
Right.
that or not.
Yeah.
Can I ask a different question on that? How do you handle the argument that it would be beyond the competence of those justices to figure out the right formula for a congressional district?
So this one I actually think is not hard. And the answer is that if we have these tools for sophisticated gerrymandering, the judges can also use the tools to assess it, right? Judges hire special masters, they hire experts. They are all the time being asked to sort through quite difficult technical questions in all variety of fields. This is actually not that hard. I feel confident about this because I am not great at math, although lately I've been trying not to go on about that. It's not very feminist to sort of be triumphant about
I'm bad at math,
I'm bad at
so
math,
don't worry about
Thank
it.
you, that makes sense. But I get this. I spent the summer reporting on this and writing about it, and I feel like I could explain it. So that makes me feel like the judges, who are often quite intellectually able, will be able to do it as well.
You're heading into the title of this panel, which Aviva Davidson wants us to address. The title is Solutions for Restoring Law and Democracy. Could the panel address possible solutions? You just gave one, Preet. Why don't you throw one out there?
Look, I think it takes some study. I think that there are various ways that people will think about reining in the excesses of this president, just like there have been before. We were talking about, George Washington comes up from time to time. He chose to establish a norm that he would only serve for 2 terms. That lasted until FDR. FDR was an incredibly popular president, saved us perhaps from world domination by the Nazis. And even though he was so popular, we changed the Constitution, which is a hard thing to do. John Kennedy appointed his own brother, Bobby Kennedy, to be the Attorney General. He was a popular Attorney General, popular president. People decided on a bipartisan basis, to pass anti-nepotism laws. I think here there are a number of areas where you could think about things. You could, and states are thinking about this with respect to how he campaigned. The issue of his tax returns have come up. States could make it a requirement that you have to release your tax returns to get on the ballot. I don't think that's a terrible idea. There's a lot swirling around with respect. There's a lot swirling around with respect to, and it's not as important as some things, but I think it's a symbolic matter. This issue of the pardon power is incredibly important. It's incredibly important to what people think Mueller's work is going to be and how much you can indulge your own self-interest.
Well, since you brought that up, because I've been wondering about this. I mean, you could make the argument that there's no real restriction on the president's pardon power. But would that be a moment? Let's say, for the sake of argument, that not only there's a few more indictments, Michael Flynn is indicted, and on one day the president just pardons everyone before trial. Is that a crisis moment?
I think so.
Oh, it's a total.
I hope so.
But see, I think this is actually where it's important to have a little perspective. I think a lot of the concern about the threats to our democracy, a lot of this is speculative and betting on the come. That is to say, in the course of this year, when Trump has moved up very close to the line, you could say he shouldn't have pardoned Joe Arpaio. I hate Joe Arpaio, but certainly he was permitted to pardon Joe Arpaio and whenever he wished to. And other presidents have done, Clinton pardoned Mark Rich. It's not good. But when this thing happened with Flynn and Comey and he fired Comey, in the end, Rosenstein came in, appointed Mueller special counsel. There is a new FBI director. And the norm has not yet been violated. Mueller hasn't been fired. Nobody has been pardoned. Well, but he could be right. So this is my point.
Would you be shocked if Mueller was fired?
No, but I do think. But I think that the evidence so far is that while he is clearly tempted to do a lot of things that other presidents, all you would have had to go is go, yeah, and he's go, okay, back off. He is not there yet. And yes, if he were to do some kind of a blanket pardon or he were to fire Mueller, the crisis for Republicans in Congress would be severe.
In some ways, the norm busting would not be the firing of Mueller or the pardoning of his associates. It would be accepting it. It would be Congress accepting it.
We have to be complicit in the erosion of the norm, right? We, the polity, the Congress, I won't say we, the Congress. But I think it's interesting, John, that you feel like until it actually happens, we're overreacting, or am I misunderstanding?
It's not that we're overreacting. I think that it is important to note that most of our norms, that is say, so he goes to Korea and he mentions the Trump golf course, which is gross.
Super tacky.
But I don't know, it's still so. That's a norm that is being violated that I don't think is sufficient unto the day to lead to the reversal of the results of an election. However, the total, suppression of the proper functioning of the law is a moment. And so all I'm saying is I think that while everybody is hyper conscious and hyper aware and assumes that he's already done this or will do it. I think that he has proven himself, proven's not the right word, but he has been less ambitious about destroying the norms than a lot of people that we live around think.
Maybe, although you could also argue that, well, first of all, we have a long time to go.
Well, we do. I'm saying this moment. I'm not talking about, I'm saying yet we're not in a constitutional crisis yet, and people said we were from January 23rd, and I think there is a bit of a Chicken Little problem. I mean, if every single thing that he does is my dear friend David Frum says, get him now, get him now, get him now. At
Yes.
some point, people get tired.
But maybe this is...
No, but
Maybe, but there's also the Chicken Little might be in this case actually holding up the sky, right, or whatever. I'm sure I'm getting the story wrong.
But that's the
ways
norm.
which are-
But that's the norm then.
Right, so
he
the
is.
only way we reinforce the norm is by noticing when he talks about his golf
Of
course.
course.
And no, he shouldn't be impeached for talking about his
Right.
golf course. But there is a way in which I also find it hugely reassuring. It helps me go to sleep at night to think that Robert Mueller is still doing his job. Like, it's become sort of totemic of the rule of law for me. But you can also argue that Trump is stuck. He has an attorney general who's recused. Trump is furious about that. He's made that clear. He doesn't respect that norm. Jeff Sessions has also made it clear that if he could do it over again, he wouldn't. Trump basically, could he even replace Jeff Sessions? So there's this sort of chasm he is looking into that is saving us, but it's also all kind of hanging by a thread.
But it's hanging.
Yes.
I know, but that's not, seriously, I don't, I say
Yeah,
it because,
it matters.
because a lot of people seem to think that we have fallen into the abyss, and I don't think we've
and
fallen
you're
into
making
the
a good
abyss.
point. I mean,
Can I-
part of it,
can-
when there was certain, let me just say one point and then pick it up. When the president's lawyer, because it happened on my show, Jay Sekulow brought up the idea that maybe Robert Mueller's job wasn't safe. You actually saw quite a reaction in the Republican Congress and Republican Senate, and that did force the president and his other lawyers to kind of at least pull back from the talk. It doesn't mean he won't do it if it ever comes to that point, but they felt a need to put it out there that they don't want to fire Mueller.
My only point is, and I get what you're saying, that we're not a complete Armageddon, but what you hear in the public forum a lot is when the president does something that causes people to be taken aback, whether it's the firing of Comey or any other of the many actions. People will say, I don't know if you credit this totally, but people will say, why are you surprised? He was signaling all these violations of norms during the campaign. And how did you, whoever they're talking about serving in the White House, how could you say that you're surprised? And I believe there's a continuum of things that are violations of norms. And I at least to this day, maybe you think differently, don't see that he sort of violated a bunch of norms and now he's evened out. I see him on a trajectory of continuing to violate more and more to the extent he can get away with it. And when he speaks, and maybe everyone is like this and I'm naive, and every president has been like this, but when he speaks, what I think is, what does he absolutely deep in his heart, to the extent there is one, what I don't want to assume facts, not on evidence. But it's a serious point. What is it that he absolutely wants to do if he had his druthers? And there are some people who, if they had their druthers, they would commit a crime. There are other people who think, you know what, my character is such, I'm not going to commit that crime. And he signals that sort of thing when he says last week, I'm not supposed to get involved with the FBI.
It's very sad.
It's very sad. It's very frustrating to me. And so do you have any, I'll give you an example of a thing that might sound polemical. I didn't take the call from the president when he called me on March 9th. And I've thought about this a lot for a lot of reasons. And if I had talked to him, I think to myself the hypothetical, I talked about this with my deputy, the acting U.S. attorney, I said, suppose I had gotten on the phone with him and I had said, you know what, Mr. President, thanks for the call, you did me a solid. Anybody bothering you lately? Anybody you want me to take a look at? This is a hypothetical, and I'm not accusing anyone of anything. But I am not positive that President Trump, if I had given him the opening, wouldn't have said, well, there's this guy and that guy in New York. And I don't know that I would have felt that way, especially in New York. I would know that I would have felt that way about other folks. So when people start to be concerned about the things that might be possible, I don't know that you should, depending on what the action could be, I don't think it's wrong for people to be, preemptively concerned about things that he might.
By the way, if you're going to set the guy up with a slow-moving fast, with a ball right down the plate like that, yes, I agree that there's no reason to believe that he wouldn't take the swing at it. All I'm saying is that we have no evidence that he has taken the swing, and the violations of norms, and this is where I get back to my point. You don't get indicted for violating norms. You get indicted or you get impeached and convicted for violating the law and committing high crimes and misdemeanors. The violations of the norms are the fault of the American people. They elected him. And this is where what people said to you is real. Okay, come on, guys. You got 304 electoral votes. That's how you got elected in the United States.
You got elected. There's no question
until
about
there are
that.
changes. So all I'm saying is the violation of the norms in the United States is the fault of the electorate. This is the one thing that you can say about Trump. He left us with no illusions about the kind of president that he was going to be.
Final question. We are out of time. And just a year from now, we all come back. Are the norms weaker or stronger?
Well, is it the day after the 2018 election? And won't the answer depend on the outcome and how we feel about how that election was conducted and how fair it was and how many people came out, et cetera, et cetera?
One answer, yeah.
I would be, to be honest, first of all, I don't see how they get stronger. So they could stay the same or get weaker. But I could offer you a scenario in which there was a Democratic blowout in 2018, and that's when the real norm challenge takes place, which is to say that between, say, November and January, when the new Congress is sworn in, Trump goes for it, does whatever it is that he has to do with the full knowledge that it is likely that the House is going to impeach him.
Yep.
And he does whatever he can do really fast with as much executive authority as he can, all personal, maybe all these pardons, maybe something. And then we have a constitutional crisis that is actually triggered in ironic ways by the proper response of the electoral system that would try to be, that would have been done to limit his power, that he has the 6 weeks interregnum in which all hell could break loose.
Do you want to...
Isn't that fun?
Well, on that note,
See?
Thank you all. Emily Bazelon, Preet Bharara, John Podhoretz, thank you all very much.